The rain hammered against the windows of the Veterans Affairs office in downtown Chicago, creating a steady percussion that seemed to match the tension in the waiting room. Marcus Chen sat in the corner, his sleeve rolled up slightly as he filled out yet another form, revealing the edge of what appeared to be an intricate tattoo wrapped around his forearm. The design was unusual, not the typical military insignia or patriotic imagery that adorned most veterans' skin, but something more abstract, almost mathematical in its precision. "Nice ink, newbie," sneered Jake Morrison, a barrel-chested former Marine whose own arms displayed a collection of traditional eagle, globe, and anchor tattoos. He lounged in his chair with the casual arrogance of someone who'd claimed this waiting room as his territory years ago. "What is that supposed to be? Some kind of fancy geometric art project?" The other veterans in the room, a mixed group of men and women from various conflicts spanning 3 decades, looked up from their magazines and phones. This was entertainment in an otherwise dreary afternoon of bureaucratic waiting. Marcus glanced up briefly, his dark eyes meeting Jake's for just a moment before returning to his paperwork. He didn't respond, which only seemed to embolden the former Marine. "I'm talking to you, college boy," Jake pressed, his voice carrying the particular brand of disdain reserved for those he perceived as soft or privileged. "That pretty little doodle there, did you get it at some hipster parlor in Brooklyn? Doesn't look like anything I've seen from the sandbox." Sarah Williams, a former Army medic with graying temples and tired eyes, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She'd seen this dynamic play out countless times before. The established veterans testing the newcomers, the pecking order being established, through a series of increasingly aggressive verbal jabs. Usually she stayed out of it, but something about Marcus's quiet dignity made her want to intervene. "Leave him alone, Jake," she said quietly. "We're all here for the same reason." But Jake was just getting started. He stood up, his considerable bulk casting a shadow over Marcus's corner of the room. "You know what I think? I think Pretty Boy here never saw real action. Probably spent his deployment pushing papers at some air-conditioned base, getting his fancy tattoo from the local artists who set up shop outside the wire." The assumption stung more than Marcus let on. He'd heard variations of this judgment before. His slight frame and quiet demeanor didn't fit the stereotypical image of a combat veteran. People saw his carefully maintained appearance, his precise way of speaking, his tendency to observe, rather than participate in the loud camaraderie that seemed to define veteran gatherings, and they made assumptions. Marcus carefully set down his pen and looked up at Jake with the same measured calm he'd maintained throughout the exchange. "It's not what you think," he said simply. "Oh, it's not?" Jake laughed, a harsh sound that drew nods and chuckles from a few of his regular companions. "Then enlighten us, Einstein. What's the deep meaning behind your abstract masterpiece there?" The tattoo in question was indeed complex. A series of interlocking patterns that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of view. There were numbers woven throughout the design, but they weren't dates or coordinates that most military tattoos featured. Instead, they seemed to follow some kind of sequence, a pattern that would be meaningless to most observers but held profound significance to those who understood its language. "It's just a tattoo," Marcus said, echoing the dismissive phrase that had been thrown at him. But even as he said it, his fingers unconsciously traced the edge of the design through his shirt sleeve, a gesture that spoke of deeper connection and meaning. Tom Bradley, a grizzled Vietnam veteran who'd been quietly reading a magazine in the corner, looked up with sharp eyes. Unlike the others, he hadn't joined in the mockery. Something about the young man's bearing reminded him of specialists he'd known, the quiet ones who did jobs nobody talked about, who carried secrets that aged them beyond their years. "Funny thing about tattoos," Tom said conversationally, his weathered voice cutting through the tension. "Sometimes they're exactly what they appear to be. Sometimes they're something else entirely." Jake turned his attention to the older veteran, momentarily thrown off by the interruption. "What's that supposed to mean, old man?" "Means maybe you should mind your own business," Tom replied with the kind of calm authority that only came from decades of experience. "We all got our stories. Some are worth telling. Others." He glanced meaningfully at Marcus. "Others are worth keeping quiet." But Jake wasn't ready to let it go. The afternoon was dragging. His benefits review had been delayed again, and he needed someone to blame for his frustration. Marcus, with his educated manner and mysterious tattoo, made a perfect target. "You know what I think your story is?" Jake continued, moving closer to Marcus's chair. "I think you're one of those stolen valor cases. Probably got yourself some military-looking tattoo to impress people, maybe get some benefits you don't deserve. That thing doesn't look like anything I've ever seen in 20 years of service." The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Stolen valor, the practice of falsely claiming military service or honors, was perhaps the gravest insult one could level at another veteran. It cut to the core of identity, honor, and sacrifice. Several people in the room shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, eager to see how the accused would respond. Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Not anger, exactly, but the familiar weight of carrying truth that couldn't be shared. He'd faced this kind of challenge before, in different contexts, and he'd learned that sometimes the only response was silence. But silence, he'd also learned, was often interpreted as guilt. "I served," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath the surface. 18 months in Afghanistan, 6 in Iraq. But I can't prove it to you in the way you'd want me to." "Can't prove it?" Jake's voice rose with triumph. "What kind of veteran can't prove their service? DD-214s are public records, son. Battle records, unit citations, all of it's documented. Unless—" He let the implication hang. "Unless what he did is still classified," Tom Bradley said suddenly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The old veteran had set down his magazine and was studying Marcus with the kind of intense scrutiny that suggested he was seeing something others had missed. The room fell silent except for the continued drumming of rain against the windows. The word "classified" had a particular weight in military circles. It separated the talkers from the doers, the public from the private, the stories that could be shared from the ones that never would be. Jake's certainty wavered for the first time. "Classified," he repeated, but with less conviction. "Right. That's what they all say when they can't back up their claims." But Tom wasn't looking at Jake anymore. He was studying the visible portion of Marcus's tattoo with the kind of recognition that sent chills down spines and made people remember that some secrets were kept for good reason. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the streets clean, while inside the VA office, a young veteran sat quietly with his mysterious tattoo, surrounded by men and women who had no idea they were in the presence of someone whose story would redefine everything they thought they knew about service, sacrifice, and the marks we carry to remember what we can never speak aloud. The tension in the waiting room had reached a breaking point when the heavy glass doors swung open with decisive force. The sound cut through the murmured conversations and hostile stares like a blade, and every head in the room turned toward the entrance. What they saw made several veterans unconsciously straighten in their chairs. Colonel Rebecca Harrison stepped through the doorway, her uniform crisp despite the storm outside, water droplets still clinging to her service cap, which she removed with practiced precision. She wasn't tall, perhaps 5'6" in her polished boots, but she carried herself with the kind of authority that filled rooms and demanded attention without saying a word. The eagles on her shoulders caught the fluorescent light. But it was her eyes that truly commanded respect, steel gray and sharp, missing nothing as they swept across the assembled veterans. Jake Morrison, who moments before had been dominating the room with his aggressive posturing, suddenly found himself remembering how to stand at attention. The muscle memory kicked in automatically, 3 decades of military conditioning overriding his civilian posture. Around the room, other veterans made subtle adjustments to their bearing, backs straightening, conversations dying, the casual disrespect of the waiting room atmosphere evaporating like morning mist. "As you were," Colonel Harrison said quietly, but her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. She moved through the room with purpose, her gaze eventually settling on the corner where Marcus still sat, paperwork forgotten in his hands, his expression unreadable but somehow more alert than it had been moments before. Sarah Williams watched, the interaction with fascination. She'd seen plenty of high-ranking officers during her service, but there was something different about this one. The colonel wasn't just visiting the VA office on routine business. She was here for a specific reason, and that reason seemed to involve the quiet young man everyone had been harassing. "Chen," Colonel Harrison said simply, and Marcus immediately stood, his civilian clothes somehow looking more like a uniform in her presence. "We need to talk." It wasn't a request. Jake Morrison opened his mouth to say something, perhaps to continue his accusations or demand an explanation. But one look from the colonel silenced him completely. She had the kind of presence that made even seasoned Marines remember their place in the hierarchy. "Ma'am," Marcus responded, and something in his tone had changed completely. Gone was the quiet defensiveness, the careful neutrality he'd maintained throughout Jake's harassment. In its place was the crisp professionalism of someone who knew exactly who he was addressing and what it meant. Tom Bradley, who had been watching the scene unfold with growing understanding, caught Sarah's eye and nodded slightly toward the colonel's uniform. "Look at her ribbons," he whispered so quietly that only she could hear. Sarah focused on the colonel's chest, trying to make sense of the array of decorations. She recognized some, the standard campaign medals, service ribbons that any career officer might wear. But there were others, small and understated, that she didn't recognize at all. They weren't the flashy commemorative medals that some officers collected. These were different, subtle, the kind of awards given for things that never made it into official records. Colonel Harrison approached Marcus with measured steps, her expression professional but not unkind. When she was close enough to speak, without the entire room hearing, she said, "There's been a development. We need to discuss the Fibonacci protocols." The effect on Marcus was immediate and startling. His entire posture shifted, and for the first time since entering the VA office, he looked like what he truly was. Not a struggling veteran seeking benefits, but a soldier receiving orders. His hand moved unconsciously to his forearm, fingers tracing the pattern of his tattoo through the fabric of his shirt. "Here?" he asked quietly, glancing around the room full of curious veterans. "Unfortunately, yes. The situation has escalated beyond our original parameters." Colonel Harrison's voice was barely above a whisper, but there was an urgency beneath her professional calm that made Marcus nod in immediate understanding. Jake Morrison couldn't contain himself any longer. The sight of this young man, the one he'd been systematically humiliating for the past hour, suddenly commanding the attention of a full colonel was more than his ego could process. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the forced respect due to rank but tinged with frustration. "But I think there might be some kind of mistake here. This guy's been claiming—" "Sergeant Morrison," Colonel Harrison interrupted, and Jake's mouth snapped shut in shock. She knew his name. She knew his rank. "While I appreciate your concern for military integrity, I can assure you that any questions about Specialist Chen's service record are well above your clearance level." The words hit the room like a physical force. Clearance level. It was a phrase that separated the military world into distinct categories. Those who knew and those who didn't. Those who could ask questions and those who had no right to the answers. Specialist Chen was never a paper pusher, the colonel continued, her voice now loud enough for the entire room to hear. He was part of a joint task force that operated under classifications that remain active to this day. His service record, his deployments, his unit assignments, all of it is compartmentalized information that will remain sealed for the foreseeable future. Marcus shifted uncomfortably under the attention. He'd spent years learning to blend in, to be forgettable, to carry his secrets without drawing notice. Having them acknowledged, even in the vaguest terms, felt like standing naked in a spotlight. Tom Bradley leaned forward in his chair, his weathered face creased with understanding. "The tattoo," he said quietly. "It's not decorative, is it?" For the first time since entering the room, Colonel Harrison smiled, a thin expression that held more weight than warmth. "Very perceptive, Master Sergeant Bradley." She'd identified his rank as easily as she had Jake's, confirming what many in the room were beginning to suspect. This wasn't a chance encounter. The mark on Specialist Chen's arm contains information that is vital to ongoing national security. "Operations," she explained, her words carefully chosen. "It's not a tattoo in the traditional sense. It's a data storage system, encoded using mathematical sequences that would be meaningless to most observers but contain crucial intelligence for those with the proper training to interpret them." The room erupted in whispered conversations as the implications of her words sank in. A tattoo that was actually a data storage system, military intelligence encoded in skin. It sounded like something from a science fiction movie, but the colonel's matter-of-fact delivery and Marcus's resigned acceptance made it clear this was very real. Sarah Williams found herself staring at Marcus with new eyes. She'd treated wounded soldiers who carried all kinds of scars and marks from their service, but she'd never encountered anything like this. "How is that even possible?" she asked, her medical training making her curious about the technical aspects. "Nanotechnology, combined with traditional tattooing techniques," Colonel Harrison replied. "The pigments contain microscopic components that react to specific stimuli, body temperature variations, electromagnetic fields, even certain chemical compounds. To most people, it appears to be an abstract design. To those with the proper equipment and knowledge, it's a complex database." Marcus finally spoke up, his voice carrying a mixture of pride and burden. "It was voluntary," he said, addressing the room but looking specifically at Jake Morrison. "When they asked for volunteers for the program, they explained the risks, not just the physical ones. The possibility of rejection, infection, the experimental nature of the technology, but the social ones too. They told us we'd never be able to prove our service in conventional ways, that we'd have to carry secrets that would isolate us from other veterans, from family, from anyone who expected traditional proof of what we'd done." The weight of his words settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Here was a soldier who had volunteered to become a living repository of classified information, knowing it would cost him the very brotherhood and recognition that most veterans valued above all else. Colonel Harrison checked her watch with practiced efficiency. "The reason I'm here, Chen, is that intelligence sources have identified a potential breach in the Fibonacci network. 3 operatives in Europe have gone dark, and we have reason to believe hostile forces may be attempting to extract or compromise the data sets. Which means," Marcus said, understanding immediately, "they'll be looking for anyone who might be carrying the encoded information." "Exactly. We need to extract and update your data package immediately. The protocols you're carrying are now considered compromised, and continuing to bear them represents an unacceptable risk to both you and the mission." Jake Morrison, who had been listening to this exchange with growing disbelief and shame, finally found his voice again. I had no idea. I thought—" "You thought what you were supposed to think," Colonel Harrison said, not unkindly. "The program was designed that way. Our operatives had to be able to operate in plain sight, to be dismissed and overlooked by anyone who might be watching. Being questioned and disbelieved by fellow veterans was actually part of their cover." The irony was devastating. Marcus's isolation, his inability to prove his service in traditional ways, his quiet endurance of suspicion and mockery, all of it had been by design. He had been hidden not despite the skepticism of his fellow veterans, but because of it. As Colonel Harrison spoke about extraction protocols and compromised networks, Marcus found himself remembering the day he'd volunteered for the Fibonacci program. It had been 3 years ago, in a nondescript office building in Langley, Virginia. He'd been 24 then, fresh from his second deployment and already carrying the invisible wounds that came with specialized operations that couldn't be discussed with therapists who lacked the proper clearance. The procedure itself will take approximately 6 hours, the colonel continued, pulling out a secure tablet that required both her fingerprint and retinal scan to unlock. We have a mobile surgical unit standing by 2 blocks from here. The extraction will remove the current data set and implant updated information, along with new biometric locks that will make unauthorized access virtually impossible. Sarah Williams, who had been absorbing this revelation with the clinical detachment of her medical training, suddenly leaned forward. 6 hours of surgery to remove and replace a tattoo? What exactly is involved in this procedure? Colonel Harrison's expression grew more serious if that was possible. The nanotechnology isn't just in the ink, Ms. Williams. The storage components are integrated at the cellular level, woven into the nerve pathways and subcutaneous tissue. Extraction requires precise mapping of neural connections and careful removal of each microscopic component. It's not unlike removing shrapnel, except the shrapnel is deliberately placed and serves a vital function. Marcus closed his eyes briefly, remembering the pain of the original procedure. They'd warned him it would be unlike anything he'd experienced, and they'd been right. Traditional tattoos were surface-level discomfort. This had been something else entirely, a deep, systematic alteration that had left him bedridden for weeks as his body adapted to its new reality. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly, and Colonel Harrison nodded with the resigned expression of someone about to deliver bad news. "The intelligence we're receiving suggests that the breach wasn't accidental," she continued. "Someone with intimate knowledge of the program has been providing information to hostile entities. We believe there may be a mole within the Fibonacci network itself." The weight of this revelation settled over the room like a toxic cloud. Tom Bradley, who had remained quietly observant throughout the exchange, spoke up with the measured concern of someone who understood the implications of betrayal at the highest levels. "How many people knew about this program?" he asked, "including support staff, technical personnel, and the operatives themselves?" "Perhaps 30 people worldwide," Colonel Harrison replied. "The compartmentalization was extreme. Even within the program, individuals only knew what they needed to know for their specific role." Marcus felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm outside. 30 people. He tried to remember faces from his training, from the medical procedures, from the debriefing sessions. Any one of them could be the source of the leak. Any one of them could be responsible for the deaths of his fellow operatives in Europe. "Colonel," Jake Morrison interrupted hesitantly, his earlier aggression completely replaced by genuine concern and embarrassment. "If this guy's life is in danger because of what he's carrying, shouldn't we be evacuating this building? Getting him somewhere secure?" It was a reasonable question, and the fact that it came from the man who had been tormenting Marcus only minutes before added an extra layer of complexity to an already surreal situation. Colonel Harrison considered the question with professional thoroughness. "The mobile unit is equipped with countermeasures and screening technology. As long as Specialist Chen remains within a 3-block radius of this building, we can monitor for hostile surveillance or electronic interference. Moving him prematurely might actually increase the risk." But even as she spoke, her secure tablet began emitting a soft but insistent chiming sound. She glanced at the screen, and Marcus watched her expression shift from professional concern to something approaching alarm. "What is it?" he asked, though part of him already knew he didn't want to hear the answer. "Satellite surveillance has detected unusual electromagnetic activity in the surrounding area," Colonel Harrison said, her fingers flying across the tablet's interface. "Someone is actively scanning for the specific frequency signatures associated with Fibonacci technology." The room erupted in nervous conversation as the implications became clear. They weren't just discussing theoretical dangers anymore. Hostile forces were actively hunting for Marcus, possibly at this very moment. The VA office, which had seemed like a mundane government building filled with bureaucratic delays, suddenly felt like a trap waiting to spring. Sarah Williams stood up abruptly, her medical training kicking in with the kind of crisis response that had served her well in combat zones. "If they're scanning for him, can't we mask the signal somehow? Block it?" "The technology is designed to be undetectable under normal circumstances," Colonel Harrison explained even as she continued monitoring her tablet for updates. "But if someone has the right equipment and knows what to look for—" She trailed off as new information appeared on her screen. Marcus felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He'd volunteered for this program knowing it would change his life, but he'd never imagined it would put innocent people in danger. The other veterans in the room, people who had their own struggles, their own challenges with the system, didn't deserve to be caught up in whatever was coming. "I should leave," he said suddenly. "Go out the back. Lead them away from here." "Absolutely not," Colonel Harrison replied with military firmness. "You're not equipped for evasive action, and we don't know how many hostiles we're dealing with, or what their capabilities are." Tom Bradley had moved to the window and was peering through the blinds at the street below. The rain continued to fall, creating a gray curtain that limited visibility, but he'd spent enough time in dangerous situations to recognize when something felt wrong. "3 vehicles have been parked outside for the past 10 minutes, he reported, quietly. "Engines running, tinted windows, could be surveillance." The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. These were veterans who had faced enemy fire, improvised explosive devices, and life-threatening situations around the world, but this was different. This was their home turf, supposedly safe territory, and the rules of engagement were unclear. Marcus made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He stood up and began rolling up his sleeve completely, exposing the full extent of his tattoo for the first time. What had appeared to be an abstract geometric pattern from a distance revealed itself to be far more complex up close. The design covered his entire forearm, flowing in intricate mathematical spirals that seemed to shift and move in the fluorescent light. Numbers were woven throughout the pattern, not random digits, but carefully placed sequences that followed the Fibonacci progression. 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, 21. Each number was integrated into the design so seamlessly that only someone who knew what to look for would recognize their significance. "If we're going to do this," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new determination, "I need you all to understand what you're looking at. This isn't just classified information. It's the location coordinates and access codes for intelligence assets across 3 continents. Dead drops, safe houses, emergency contacts, extraction routes. If hostile forces get their hands on this information, they don't just compromise one operation. They unravel an entire network that's taken decades to establish." Jake Morrison stared at the tattoo with a mixture of awe and horror. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. "You've been walking around with all that information literally under your skin." "For 3 years," Marcus confirmed. "Every day, knowing that. If I was captured, if I was tortured, if someone figured out what I was carrying." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone in the room understood the implications. Colonel Harrison's tablet chimed again, and this time her expression showed genuine urgency. "We're out of time," she announced. "Thermal imaging shows multiple figures moving toward the building from 3 different directions. They know he's here." The moment had arrived when theoretical danger became immediate threat. Outside, the rain continued to fall on a city that had no idea a shadow war was about to unfold in the waiting room of a Veterans Affairs office. Inside, a group of veterans who had started the day dealing with mundane bureaucratic problems suddenly found themselves on the front lines of an intelligence operation that would test everything they thought they knew about duty, loyalty, and the price of keeping secrets. Marcus looked around the room at the faces of men and women who, despite not knowing his true story, had shared the bond of military service with him. In a few minutes, that bond would be tested in ways none of them could have imagined. The rain against the windows sounded like distant gunfire, and somewhere in the storm, enemies were closing in on a secret that could change the balance of power in ways that would never make the evening news. The next few minutes unfolded with the surreal precision of a military operation conducted by people who weren't supposed to be soldiers anymore. Tom Bradley took charge with the natural authority of someone who had led men through worse situations, his weathered hands already checking the exits and assessing defensive positions with the methodical calm of a career NCO. "Sarah, get on the phone with building security," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority that had once moved entire platoons. "Tell them we have a medical emergency and need all entrances locked down immediately. Don't mention anything else." Sarah was already moving, her combat medic training overriding any hesitation. She'd seen enough firefights to know that the time for questions had passed and the time for action had arrived. Jake Morrison, the man who had spent the past hour questioning Marcus's integrity, now found himself standing shoulder to shoulder with the veteran he'd been tormenting. "What do you need me to do?" he asked Marcus directly, and there was no trace of his earlier hostility, only the focused determination of a Marine who had found his mission. "The building has 3 main entrances," Colonel Harrison said, consulting, a building schematic on her tablet while simultaneously coordinating with unseen forces through her earpiece. "Front lobby, service entrance on the west side, and emergency exit on the second floor that leads to the parking garage. If they're professionals, and the intelligence suggests they are, they'll try to control all 3 simultaneously." Marcus felt the familiar sensation of his tattoo beginning to warm slightly against his skin. It was a feature he'd never mentioned to anyone, not even during his debriefings. The nanotechnology responded to stress hormones, creating a subtle temperature increase that served as an early warning system. The technology was more sophisticated than even the colonel knew, and Marcus had spent 3 years learning to interpret its subtle signals. "They're close," he said quietly. "The bioindicators are responding to proximity scanners, maybe 200 meters and closing." Through the rain-streaked windows, Tom Bradley could see movement in the parking lot below. Dark figures in civilian clothing were positioning themselves with military precision, their coordination speaking to professional training and careful planning. These weren't opportunistic criminals or amateur intelligence operatives. They were seasoned professionals who had been hunting Fibonacci operatives for longer than anyone had realized. "Colonel," Marcus said, making a decision that would have shocked his handlers 3 years ago, "I need to tell you something about the program that wasn't in my official debriefing." Even in the midst of the crisis, Colonel Harrison's attention sharpened. Undisclosed information from a Fibonacci operative was potentially more dangerous than the current tactical situation. "The tattoo isn't just storing the information you think it is," Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the gravity of what he was revealing. "During the integration process, I retained consciousness longer than the medical team expected. I saw additional data being encoded, information that wasn't part of my mission briefing." The colonel's expression went from concern to something approaching shock. "What kind of information?" "Identities," Marcus said simply. "Not just asset locations and access codes, but the real names and current identities of every person involved in the Fibonacci program. Including yours, Colonel, including the program directors, including." He paused, glancing around the room at the veterans who had become unwitting participants in an intelligence war, "including the mole." The revelation hit the room like a physical force. For 3 years, Marcus had been walking around, with not just strategic intelligence but the complete roster of one of the most classified programs in U.S. military history. He was a living database of secrets that could destroy careers, compromise national security, and get dozens of people killed. Jake Morrison let out a low whistle. "No wonder they want you dead, kid." But it was Tom Bradley who grasped the most significant implication. "If you know who the mole is, why didn't you report it?" Marcus's expression grew complicated, and for the first time since the crisis began, he looked uncertain. Because the mole isn't someone who betrayed the program, he said slowly. The mole is someone who was supposed to betray it. It's part of a larger operation. Controlled disinformation designed to feed false intelligence to hostile networks while protecting the real assets. Colonel Harrison's tablet slipped from her fingers, clattering to the floor as the implications of Marcus's words sank in. You're saying the breach is intentional? I'm saying the breach you know about is intentional, Marcus corrected. But there's a second breach, a real one, that the program directors don't know about. Someone has been using the controlled leak as cover for their own intelligence gathering. They've been selling real Fibonacci secrets while everyone assumes the compromised information is part of the disinformation campaign. The tactical situation outside had grown more urgent while they'd been talking. Sarah Williams returned from her call to building security with grim news. They can lock down the main entrances, but they're reporting technical difficulties with the electronic systems. Someone's been jamming their communications. Through the windows, they could see that the dark figures had moved closer. They were no longer attempting to remain hidden. Their positioning suggested they were preparing for immediate action. Colonel Harrison retrieved her tablet and began typing rapidly. I'm calling in federal response teams, but they're at least 20 minutes out in this weather. 20 minutes might as well be 20 hours, Tom Bradley observed grimly. We need to assume we're on our own until then. It was Jake Morrison who voiced what everyone was thinking. So what's the play here? We can't fight professional operatives with whatever improvised weapons we can find in a government office building. Marcus stood up, his decision made. We don't fight them, he said with the calm certainty of someone who had finally found clarity in an impossible situation. We give them what they want. Absolutely not, Colonel Harrison said immediately. The information I'm carrying includes the identity of the real mole, Marcus interrupted. But more importantly, it includes the locations of 3 emergency dead drops that contain evidence of the double operation. If I can get to one of those locations, I can prove who's really behind the breaches and stop this before more operatives die. He rolled up his sleeve again, exposing his tattoo to the room. But this time, he did something none of them had seen before. He pressed his thumb against a specific point in the design, and the entire pattern began to shift slightly, revealing hidden layers of information that had been invisible moments before. The Fibonacci sequence isn't just decorative, he explained as the numbers seemed to dance and rearrange themselves across his skin. It's an interactive interface. I can access different layers of data depending on biometric inputs, fingerprint, pressure, body temperature, even specific thought patterns that trigger measurable changes in neural activity. Sarah Williams stared at the shifting tattoo with professional fascination and personal horror. How much of your body have they modified? She asked quietly. More than you'd want to know, Marcus replied honestly. But right now, that's our advantage. They expect me to be a passive data storage device. They don't know I can actively manipulate the information, or that I've been carrying evidence of their own crimes for the past 3 years. Outside, the storm was beginning to intensify. Lightning flashed across the dark sky, illuminating the faces of the operatives who had taken positions around the building. Inside the VA office, a group of veterans who had started their day dealing with routine bureaucratic problems were about to become the last line of defense in a shadow war that would determine the fate of intelligence operations around the world. Marcus looked at each of them. Jake Morrison, who had gone from antagonist to ally. Sarah Williams, whose medical training had prepared her for crisis but not conspiracy. Tom Bradley, whose decades of experience had given him the wisdom to recognize when ordinary rules no longer applied, and Colonel Harrison, who was discovering that even her high-level clearance hadn't given her the complete picture. I need to ask you all to do something that goes against every instinct you have as veterans, Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of someone about to make an impossible request. I need you to trust me to walk out that door and surrender myself to hostile operatives, knowing that if I'm wrong about what I think I know, I'll be tortured for information that could compromise national security for decades. The room fell. silent except for the sound of rain and distant thunder. Outside, lightning illuminated a world where the lines between friend and enemy, truth and deception, duty and betrayal had become hopelessly blurred. Inside, the bond between veterans, forged in shared service and tested by impossible choices, was about to face its ultimate challenge. The war that had brought them all together years ago in distant countries was coming home, and the battlefield would be a government office building where secrets masqueraded as tattoos, and the greatest acts of courage would be measured not in medals earned, but in trust given to a soldier whose story no one would ever be allowed to tell.